Okay, let's just jump right into this interview. Um, what does politics mean to you?
Well, I think for me it has two definitions. Politics in general is the use of power. So people
Mm,
talk about being political in organizations, playing politics. It's the study of power. It's the use of power. And then I guess when you put it into the public service domain or in government, it's the use of power and the distribution of power inside of our government.
I'd say that's pretty accurate. Um, what do you think this has an impact on your life? How do these people deciding where power is distributed, how does that affect you?
Well, I think it affects us because, one, it affects us in terms of the laws that are enacted affect us. But I think um, more than, I think of more concern than that is not just the laws and policy changes, but the way that our politicians are behaving sets a
Mm-hmm.
tone for our culture and our national character. So I think in terms of how it affects me, I think in some ways it remotely affects me based on those policies, but in a major way it affects me and those of us based on the culture because that's everywhere.
Do you think political activism is necessary to a democracy?
Well, I think so because in a democratic society, it's the rule of the people, but we are in a republic, which means we aren't a pure democracy. Everyone doesn't have sort of an equal vote. Our votes then are given to representatives, and how those representatives use their power, gain more power over others means that some people's votes get amplified and some get um, diminished.
Did you vote in the last election?
I did. Last presidential
Mm-hmm.
election, I did.
Do you think that your vote matters?
My vote probably doesn't matter because I'm a Californian, and in California, it's pretty clear who's going to win in the presidential race, and so I vote, but um, that doesn't necessarily sway it. And that's one of the things with the Electoral College is that some states are swing states, and some
Yeah,
are determined based on the demographics of the state.
sure. So, if a vote didn't go your way, what would you do? Let's say something that was really important to you that didn't go your way that you voted on, what would you do if it didn't pass?
Well, I have to honestly say there are very few issues that I would feel strongly if they didn't go my way, but
Okay.
more like candidates. But I think if like in a presidential election, it's really more about a candidate than it is about particular legislation. But um, you,
Sure.
you either like the resist movement, you either do that on social media or you demonstrate or you contact your representatives. There are all ways that you can say, I'm not happy with the outcome of that.
Yeah. And so, when you think political activism, what will bring you to those things that you think political activism is? Like, what hypothetically would draw you to take action?
Well, I think what draws people to take action are a function of a lot of things. Probably for me, it would be two big things, which is one, the magnitude of the issue, how much it matters to me, and two, how um, sort of the efficacy, whether or not you think your actions will actually have an effect on the outcome.
All right. When you see the current state of affairs, when you watch the news, what does it make you think this country values most?
Well, I think it's very clear that what the country values most is prosperity and wealth because Well, it's pretty well documented that most elections are determined based on the economy. And, if the economy's doing well, like an incumbent president tends to stay in power. So I think, um, it's true that, I mean, I'm not comfortable with it, but it seems to be true that most people want to see a good economy and a stable economy. And a lot of people vote with their pocketbooks, meaning what's going to be advantageous for me and
for
my
them.
bank account.
Sure.
I don't like to believe that, but I think it's actually fairly well proven to be true.
I think in America there's this big value of individuals, the individualism, where the individual decides what is necessary, and what extent do you think the government is responsible versus we are responsible as people?
Mm. So, well, I think there's two issues there that are conflated in that question. One is what's the right balance between individualism and collectivism? And then sort of the individual role versus the government role, which is a little bit different because you don't need the government to be operating with sort of a collective will and a collective view. But um,
All right, so there's this idea of procedural guarantees that we really value in America. That is the process in which the government exercises its power or makes decisions should be fair, and that's the value rather than necessarily the outcome. Um, what In what ways do you think these procedural guarantees are not being met? And what areas of change are there for the government?
hmm, well, I think most of our institutions are set up to be fair, and I think our laws are generally set up to be fair. It's then what changes that is the way power is used inside of organizations. And power is primarily a function of money. And, we know in our country that, that we're sort of guaranteed due process, but that money fixes a lot of problems in that process. And the wealthy have a disproportionate voice into how laws are enacted. They also have a disproportionate influence on how laws are enforced. And with a lot of money,
Yeah.
you can get away with a lot of um, bad behavior. And we also see, so that's the powerful, and power is and money tend to be pretty close surrogates. And then we see those who don't have a lot of power and, historically discriminated or voiceless populations. And we know that there's a negative effect of that due process, that there's certain populations that are kind of, I guess probably the fundamental part of our due process is this belief that you are innocent until proven guilty. And, there's lots of populations for whom that assumption is reversed, that they're they're guilty until proven innocent, and the proving of innocence usually takes money or power, and often they lack both.
Definitely. When I say institutionalized racism, what does that make you think of?
Institutionalized racism, I think about the power, like, institutions are affected by power dynamics. And so there's part of that racism where certain people lack power and lack representation. But institutional racism is also, I think, a function of the biases that are held by people in the institution.
In
Because,
those places of power?
yeah, because they're really, an institution is a concept, an incorporation of on paper, but
It's
institutions are
how.
collections of people and those
Sure.
in power and the assumptions that they hold about certain races or about gender or a number of things.
So when you see some institutions. Let's say there's like police brutality or institutions where these people are not upholding the values that we want to be upholding. In the example of police brutality, just pure violence. Like what responsibility do we have as citizens to check and change our institutions?
Well, maybe a broad categorization is conscious racism and unconscious bias. And I think we've been trying to rid our organizations of conscious racism for years. We've enacted laws, we've created
Yeah,
affirmative action plans, we've done a lot from a legislative standpoint, and a lot of people say that's done.
and check it off the
Check
box.
it off. We elected a black
Yeah,
president. Clearly, we're not a racist society, but I think there's a lot of work that's been done in the last, I don't know, 5 years in particular on unconscious bias, and that all of us hold certain assumptions, and it comes from like a basic biological um, drive to want to feel more comfortable around people who are like you. Like our brains are wired to feel more secure with people who seem like they're in our tribe, they mean us no harm, and that our brains put up a little bit of a caution sign when we're around people who are different than us. And it's fairly well proven from a neuroscience standpoint.
what?
You're telling me to speed up. Um,
uh,
but like, so we all have this, and that's the unconscious bias, is that we often don't realize that we hold certain assumptions,
mm-hmm.
and that we might then carry over certain assumptions about certain people are more prone to illegal activity, and we can end up either doing things that really harm other groups or not seeing the institutional racism because
Yeah,
it's all so subtle.
exactly. We
Maybe
build
I should
up
have said
these.
that faster for you, but actually it's a pretty
No,
important idea. I was trying to get
that
my
was a
words
great
around.
response, and we have a lot of these cognitive distortions that we build up. But I think it's clear that you believe in basic human rights. That all when it comes down to it, we're all the same, and that we're all equal. But to what extent do you think democracy is a human right?
I don't think democracy is a human right because democracy is actually not practiced in most of the world. And I wouldn't say that most of the world is an active human rights violation. Um,
All right. When you see
and
authoritarian system,
democracy is not necessarily a proven system. I think the jury is still out,
mm-hmm.
pun very much intended on that, that, democracy is, I think in the West and in democratic societies, we assume that democracy is a superior system, and it feels like it should be, but it's still early days in this experiment to see if it really is, like, if we are capable of a true democracy.
Yeah, yeah, it's really hard to say. Um, I was gonna ask you when,
And there's sort of like a worldwide reverberation against democracy right
yeah,
now, which is interesting. Like, why is that happening? Because it must.
because a lot of these countries that are supposed to uphold democracy maybe aren't doing the best things around the world, and so to them it might be different. But when you see these like authoritarian systems where they're the individuals are not citizens; they're subjects of the state, and they don't have any rights over what that state's gonna do. How do you think they hold back worldwide progress? And do you think that as Americans we have um, a, a need to get rid of or do something about these authoritarian states around the world?
Well, do they hold back worldwide progress? It's a really good question because I can't really point to anything that says here is how that's done. I mean, maybe for starters, usually in an authoritarian regime, education is not a, I don't know if the fundamental right is the right word,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not ubiquitous. It's not, access to education usually isn't as plentiful as it is in a democracy. And, we can probably show pretty clearly that an educated society is going to be a more prosperous society. Um,
Definitely.
then there's fuzzier things like, well, in an authoritative state, it means that you have to have you have a few really supposed smart people making the decisions. And I'm a believer that you probably make better decisions when you can harness collective intelligence and will. You tend to get suppression of diversity in those systems, and I think there's a fair bit of research that says diversity tends to be our friend in terms of making sound decisions and innovating. And but
Mm-hmm.
maybe these are romanticized views of the West,
Well,
but you could also say that if you look at China, that is not a democracy. It's a single party kind of state. They've made a tremendous amount of progress in a non democratic, kind of quasi capitalistic, sort of socialistic system with a single party, a fairly authoritative rule. They've been able to regulate their economy and have a planned economy in a way that's created a tremendous amount of progress.
and they're on the rise for sure.
And maybe, not in terms of human rights, but economic. So, who
And
am I to
that's
really say democracy is the only way to achieve progress
mm-hmm.
in a society?
Yeah, and I think it really just comes down to it is what are you going to count as progress? Because certainly we have our own problems as well, and it doesn't. We don't always have the best outcome with how things work.
Yeah, we tend to think we're superior, but when you look at all the indicators, it's not usually the case. But what do you measure progress? Economic progress, human rights progress, progress in the arts, educational progress, growth in IQ, healthcare access, mortality rates,
All
you
right,
know,
and I think we'll conclude it there. Thank you, Mom.
where are the hard questions? Oh, those were good
We're at
questions.
17 minutes here.
Okay, those were good questions.